And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to bring up the team that worked to develop the Washington and Jefferson College Energy Index. And this will actually include the chair of our Board of Trustees, Ms. Barbara DeWitt.
Thank you, Jay. I'm so happy to be here to introduce something that's really remarkable in the life of the college. And despite what Jay implied, I had nothing to do with it. But all too often, academic work is hidden from view. Knowledge is transferred from teacher to student in the classroom, but the process is not one that the public or anyone else gets to see. Today, we're celebrating the public dissemination of knowledge, particularly knowledge of economics, in a way that will enable the world, and most importantly, the United States, to understand things a little better. As a trustee, it's been my pleasure for the last 6 years to work with the president of Washington and Jefferson College, Tori Herring-Smith. Allow me to bring her to the podium so that she can tell us about the Washington and Jefferson College Energy Index.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And there's some members of the team that are out in the audience I want to recognize as well, and those are the individuals who form the advisory committee for the Center for Energy Policy and Management. And I'll just ask them to stand. There are 5, so there are 6. Hold your applause till the end. Pat McCune from Washington, Pennsylvania, the CEO of Community Bank. Jim Benzie from our Political Science Department. Leslie Dunn from our Economics Department. Bob Dolence from, there we are, great. Jack Ubinger from PEC, Pennsylvania Environmental Council, and Jeff Norton from Eckerd Siemens in Harrisburg. Thank you all for serving the center. So we've heard a lot today from the panel, and thank you so much, Susan, for that far-reaching and wonderful talk. I feel like I was drinking from a fire hose as you were speaking. It was truly wonderful. From both the anecdotes, I will never forget the long pole, I assure you, to the amazing amount of data that you were able to give us. Thank you. We've heard a lot about the need to educate people, and that's what the Washington and Jefferson College Energy Index is all about. It represents the work of many different people at W&J, but it's primarily the brainchild of 2 economists, Robert and Leslie Dunn, who are going to discuss the index in detail in a few minutes. I am not an economist, and nor do I play one on television, but as the president of the college, I've had the pleasure of working with these 2, and I want to provide you briefly with a layperson's view of the index. The creation of the Washington and Jefferson College Energy Index has been the major focus of the Center for Energy Policy and Management because we feel it is an important need in our country. Since President Nixon inaugurated Project Independence in 1973, the country has focused on our need to secure an energy supply. And in the more than 30 years since Nixon's presidency, every leader has echoed his call for independence. And yet the country, as we heard this morning, has not had a strong energy policy, nor has it had a readily available, sophisticated, but clear benchmark to help us track our energy independence. In a democracy that requires voters and legislators to be able to understand how policy decisions do and do not advance our national goals, we need these common benchmarks in order to see how we change consistently over time. We can get a sense of our economic health by tracking GDP. We can measure consumer attitude with the Consumer Confidence Index, and we can even, perhaps, assess airport safety with different colors from the TSA safety levels. But we have no public benchmark, not even green, yellow, orange, or red, for energy independence. With the Washington and Jefferson College Energy Index, I hope we can change that. The energy index that we have developed is based upon publicly available data that has been thoroughly vetted and is widely accepted. We know the data is solid. We are not generating new data. But what we are doing is analyzing it to create this benchmark through a proprietary algorithm. While industry groups and political think tanks have generated various ways of measuring energy production and consumption, that work differs from ours in several important ways. First, the Washington and Jefferson College Energy Index has been developed without any kind of political or commercial agenda. We are not trying to prove a point or to encourage investment, but just to disseminate knowledge. We hope that this information will be useful to policymakers and industry leaders, but we're not creating the index in order to act as advocates for any particular position, although certain particular positions may be supported by the data therein. Secondly, whereas most indexes focus primarily on one type of energy, petroleum being the most common, our index examines the full tapestry of energy sources, including oil, coal, nuclear, renewables, and natural gas. In this way, it provides a fuller picture of our national energy use. Thirdly, our work is based upon solid historical data. It does not attempt to be predictive. In fact, the basic Washington and Jefferson College Energy Index was calculated as far back as 1949, giving us the opportunity to test its validity over time and to see large-scale trends in our country's energy use. This does not mean, however, that the Energy Index only looks backward. As you will see, it identifies trends in energy use, and those trend lines can be indicators of future behavior. And finally, the Washington and Jefferson College Energy Index is not just about economics, but as Rob and Leslie will explain, it also draws upon the fields of political science and history, giving it a kind of multidisciplinary breadth that's characteristic of a liberal arts college. Information generated by the index will be released at least quarterly as a matter of course, but we will also be able to respond to current events. For example, should prices at the gas pump continue to rise, we can provide perspective on that concern. Or should Iran close the Straits of Hormuz, we can use the index's data to examine the probable effect such a global event would have on our energy independence here at home. In addition, the data that generates the index will be fully available on the Center's website. In this way, our work is transparent and it's available for others to use. Researchers, journalists, and just plain curious people can mine the data as they choose in order to find correlations between historic events, political movements, and our national energy independence. To give you more details about the index, how it was created, and the kind of data it can produce, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the creators, Drs. Robert and Leslie Dunn, both faculty members here at W&J. Their full bios are in the program, so I won't repeat their credentials here, but I must thank them very much for their work, which has been extensive and incredibly sophisticated, and I appreciate everything that they have done. We're going to begin with Leslie explaining in greater detail how the index was developed, and Rob will follow and demonstrate some of the data that we have uncovered, giving you some of the early indications of the energy index. Leslie.
When developing the index, we began with national measures of energy consumption and imports. Our main source for these statistics is the annual energy review produced by the U.S. Energy Information Administration. All indices created consider the primary energy sources of coal, natural gas, petroleum, nuclear, and renewables, consisting of hydro, geothermal, solar, wind, and biomass, including biofuels. Each index has two main components. The first is the weight applied to each primary energy source. The weight is the share of the total consumption, measured in BTUs, coming from the primary energy source. For instance, in the previous 5 years, petroleum has accounted for between 36 to 40% of total energy consumption in the US, whereas coal has accounted for 20 to 22% of total energy consumption, showing the relative importance of petroleum in the calculated index value. This calculated weight is then applied to the second main component of the index, which is the share of domestic consumption being supplied by domestic sources. This value is calculated by comparing consumption and imports of each primary energy source. These calculations allow us to create the base Washington and Jefferson Energy Index. The index value can range from 0 to 100. A value of 0 means none of our energy consumption is being supplied by domestic sources, whereas a value of 100 would mean that all of our domestic consumption is being supplied by domestic sources. The index value for 2011 was 74.2. This value can be interpreted as 74% of U.S. energy consumption is being supplied domestically. Each national index measure created was a variation of the base Washington and Jefferson Energy Index. The first variation made was to include the value of U.S. exports. It is common for the U.S. to both import and export energy sources. For instance, in February 2012, we imported more than 10 million barrels of petroleum per day, while exporting just over 3 million barrels of petroleum per day, which is a significant increase in the petroleum exports values being exported by the U.S. In this variation of the index, we added back in the export values with the assumption that if the domestic economy needed additional supplies, these exports could be rerouted to domestic sources. For this reason, the value of the index, including exports, will always be greater than the base Washington and Jefferson Energy Index. When discussing the issue of energy independence and security, the conversation usually leads to who our import partners are. The market for petroleum is unique in that production is concentrated, and some countries with large supplies have different incentives that complicate the market, such as political motivations. To incorporate these ideas, a common measure of industry concentration was applied to gauge the diversity of our supplies. Nationalized oil companies are a significant portion of the world oil market, and this could increase the possibility of supply disruptions in the market. Related to this, social and political uncertainty within an oil exporting country could impact production and the supply to the world market and to the U.S. For instance, the U.S. almost certainly prefers to import primary energy sources from Canada, a neighboring country with a stable political environment, versus a country with social and political tensions. This is particularly true given the current importance of petroleum to the domestic economy. To include this concern, a measure of political stability created by the World Bank World Governance Indicators was also incorporated into the index. The issue of energy independence could also be applied to the subnational level. The base Washington and Jefferson Energy Index was calculated for the 4 U.S. Census regions by aggregating state-level production and consumption statistics for each U.S. state. All statistics for the regional indices are from the State Energy Data System created by the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Now the concept of an import is anything that is consumed within a region that is produced outside of the country or outside of that region. One of the interesting outcomes of the regional index measures is the ability to compare the primary energy consumption mixes over time for each region. The primary advantages of the Washington and Jefferson Energy Index are first, the historical picture that can be captured for both national and regional perspectives. The national base Washington and Jefferson Energy Index begins in 1949. The regional indexes begin in 1960. Second, the use of consistent, publicly available data in the creation of all the indices, and the inclusion of renewables in addition to fossil fuels. And finally, the easily interpreted index value created by each index. A goal throughout the project was to create an output that has a clear interpretation, and we feel that the Washington and Jefferson Energy Index meets this goal. Robert Dunn will now explain some of the applications of the indices.
Okay, I'm going to sort of provide some examples and show different ways that the index data could be used to kind of deal with some of the regional issues and some current events. So I have slides. So this first slide is showing the base index and the different presidential administrations since 1949. So the slide shows the presidential administrations over this time period, which spans the length of our data and the administrations of Harry Truman through Barack Obama. Blue represents Democratic administrations, and red represents Republican administrations. The line represents the Washington and Jefferson Energy Index. So what you can see is since, and Tori sort of mentioned this, since the first oil crisis in 1973 and the administration of Richard Nixon, this energy independence has been an explicit goal of every president since 1973. That began with Project Independence from the Nixon administration, right? And that continues through today to the most recent State of the Union address from President Obama. Right? So what we see from the chart is in the 1950s, independence was high, but increased energy consumption and demand, particularly with regards to petroleum, was increasingly satisfied with imported energy sources. So this corresponds to the green section of the line. Right? It also corresponds to population movements in the U.S., to the South and West, from the Northeast and Midwest. And related to this is the increased use of the automobile and the establishment of the interstate highway system. Right? In 1979, the 1979 oil crisis led to reduced petroleum availability and sharply higher oil prices. The effect was that this reduced consumption and created an increased focus on energy efficiency. The impact of this can be seen as the white portion, right, as independence increased from the mid-1970s until 1985, a pretty noticeable jump. Since 1985, independence has consistently declined through the late 2000s until the last few years. This is shown by the black portion of the line, and I'll talk more about this towards the end of my presentation. So the next slide shows the regional components. And first, what we have, right, is the primary energy mix in 1960 for each of the 4 census regions. And you can see the different energies listed at the bottom. And then what we have is that same mix in 2009, which is the most recently available data at the regional level. And this was sort of mentioned in the panel. Given the geographic size of the U.S. and the mobility of our population, we feel that a regional analysis is very useful. The regional perspective allows us to consider a few things: differences in the cost of energy based on source locations, differences in environmental impacts and transport, and differences in the contribution of the energy industry to regional and local job markets, among other things. As one example to show how this can be important, electricity prices in Pennsylvania averaged approximately 10 cents per kilowatt hour in 2011. The price in New York State was 15 cents per kilowatt hour for that same year. So what we see is there can be substantial variation even within a region. And so what this chart allows us to do is examine changes in primary energy consumption at the regional level, and allows for clear comparisons of different energy patterns in the U.S. So what we want to do next then is we're going to focus on the Northeast so that we can see for one region how this has changed. And you can see that this is pretty dynamic. So this is taking that information from before just for the Northeast and showing the energy mix in 1960. So you can see a heavy reliance on coal and petroleum. If we update this to 2009, we see some very noticeable changes. Right? We can see that the reliance on petroleum and coal has reduced substantially, while natural gas, nuclear, and renewables have become increasingly important in our region. One implication, just to sort of think about in everyday life, is that this means the electricity that we use, for lighting, heating, and cooling, and all of our electronic devices now, that electricity is increasingly coming from natural gas, renewables, and nuclear energy. Next, we can see how the index can help us understand or talk about current events. Right? So this is a chart of the gasoline prices and the base Washington and Jefferson Energy Index. Right? So gasoline is an essential part of our economy, and the price changes we know are followed closely by households and the media. In this chart, we see that gas prices and energy independence have often been closely related. Generally, lower prices lead to higher consumption, and this consumption was increasingly satisfied with imported energy as domestic oil production peaked in the 1970s. After the early 2000s, gas prices increased noticeably and returned to levels last seen during the 1979 oil crisis, the exception being the economic recession, which you can see the big dip. And after a lag of several years, energy independence is increasing in the U.S. In part, this can be attributed to increased domestic production, reduced petroleum consumption, and improved energy efficiency. Transportation provides one example. In 1980, the average miles per gallon for a passenger car in the U.S. was 24 miles per gallon. That figure for passenger cars now is 34 miles per gallon. So a noticeable increase in the efficiency in transportation. A related point, right, and there are various reasons why the higher gas prices have been seen from the previous slide. One interesting connection is the increasing energy consumption in general, and petroleum specifically, coming from developing economies. So here we see that China's share of total world petroleum consumption has increased noticeably since the early 2000s, along with their economic emergence, while the U.S. share of total world petroleum consumption is decreasing. And if you look at the total energy pattern, the same pattern holds. So this one example shows the importance of understanding connections in a global energy market, which has been talked about earlier. And the Washington and Jefferson Energy Index aims to increase understanding in this area with all of these connections. Finally, looking at the last decade. So this is the base index again, just highlighting the last decade, right? The last 10 years provide some interesting trends. In the mid-2000s, the share of energy consumption coming from domestic sources was at its lowest point ever. Since this time, energy independence has increased substantially. It's been about 9% since 2005 alone, as domestic oil and natural gas production has increased. We've also seen improvements in energy efficiency in all sectors of the economy, so we can see the trend is pretty strong here. Final thing is that, as Leslie mentioned, in conclusion, our current independence measure for the Washington and Jefferson Energy Index is 74%. The last time the measure was this high was 1999, so more than 12 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Leslie. As I mentioned, other bits of information that have been gleaned through the index are going to be released periodically, at least quarterly, as a routine matter of course. And I've seen some of the things that are coming. They're pretty interesting. I particularly like that gas slide. I think it's interesting the way the gas prices and the energy independence follow one another for a while and then diverge so radically. I want to know more about that. When I began the morning, I said that we developed the Washington and Jefferson College Center for Energy Policy and Management in order to be a better partner to the community surrounding us. And to complete the presentation of the Energy Index, we've asked Senator Tim Solobay to come and offer us his reflections on that connection and that partnership. Senator Solobay.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, and thank you for your leadership on this and WJ's commitment to not only our region and our local area for something as important as our energy issues, but all the different things that WJ has done to be a great local partner here in our tri-county, tri-state area. So I appreciate that. One of the things I would tie to this is we look at how the index works, and some things tied to that is that the policy issues discussed, as well as how that separates from politics, because there could be a whole lot of issues that educational and policy guided and driven, but unfortunately, at least in our world and the other elected officials in the room, know that sometimes there's a mix of policy issues when it comes to tied back to politics. That's why with the important part, I think what you'll be able to help provide to us, we can try to educate and bring educated facts to the table, but oftentimes, whether it be the industry partners trying to tie the education back to what's going on a particular side of energy, or elected officials trying to do that same, it isn't always accepted as readily as it would be from maybe an educational institution, giving it more of a third party and a separation. So I appreciate how that is. And the key, and I believe this is going to occur during this whole index, is that the hypotheticals that sometimes have a tendency of turning and twisting and scaring folks will be separated under the true facts of what's actually going on. And as much as we try to do that, sometimes it still isn't accepted. So hopefully through an educational presentation of an index such as this, that will be helped out. As we all well know, has been talked about already, this area, this region, has a strong history and collaboration on energy industry, especially on the extraction type energies, coal and gas being the specific ones. Mainly for our heating and power uses, but I think as we move forward, as you've heard already, that additional uses of especially gas and other technologies of coal are very, very important, so that the economics of what these two major extraction minerals do for our area continue to move forward. I was also glad to hear that you mentioned hydro as another alternative, because with our system of rivers and waterways we have here in this area, hydro has also an opportunity, and to study that further. I know there was a presentation just a few weeks back down in the Mon Valley, utilizing our lock system and doing some different things with turbines on and off the lock system, providing another source of a renewable energy, and in my opinion shows a much more, friendlier footprint than would be with all those windmills across the mountain ridges that are out there, and acres of solar panels that take up a larger footprint that are out there. So if we're going to be looking at renewables and considering renewables, I think those that have a smaller footprint should also be tied and considered. You know, as they created the energy index grouping, we had talked about this area being the energy capital of the East. And there's been a lot of other partners prior to the college coming on board that have helped create and make that go forward. And I would be remiss without re-mentioning again Pat McEwen and his foresight on what he thought when this whole gambit of energy and gas began 4 or 5 years ago, with the creation of what's been well-versed and well-known as the Tri-County Oil and Gas Expo Committee. Over those period of years that's been in existence, it has been a master education piece as well on both the economic side and educational side, tying in both existing industry organizations such as the Marcellus Shale Coalition folks and their organization, and PIOGA, which is the Pennsylvania Independent Oil and Gas Association. That collaboration between them, as well as with things that Pat has worked forward with his committee, not only have created expos and opportunities for our business ventures here in this area to either recreate themselves or find their niche or their opportunity, and how the gas industry in particular will fit into their work platform, but it has also been a good platform for us to work on from the government side of things when we try to move forward on job creation, job training, and job education. So again, the index just kind of helps wrap and pull that all together, giving us, again, another third-party look at how this is all bringing itself together. Also, as you've heard with Professors Dunn, as I'll relate to it, what they are doing in examining the overall impact, not only on energy and specifically, but I know they're going to highlight it specifically the Marcellus Shale, and now with Utica also becoming very active in our area, more so in eastern Ohio than western Pennsylvania, but it's also going to be tied into it. So all of that working together, and that's the key, the collaboration of everyone working together on this from a government side, from a business side, and an educational side that the college is bringing together. It's somewhat exciting because this is something we haven't seen, I think, as individuals since probably back in the era of the steel renaissance, back during the Carnegie days when steel became the master of Western Pennsylvania. And as we diversify the opportunities, as was talked about earlier, not having your eggs all in one basket, I think that's also going to be very important to make sure that the economy here in Western Pennsylvania and the state in general is better matched than it was back years ago when we focused all on single individual industries, and whenever those industries happen to go soft or collapse, then we become into the economic problems that we experienced, especially in this region back during the 1980s, whenever steel did have a real bad turnaround and go the other way. So I'm excited by what's going on, glad to be part of this, and the opportunity to share with you my thoughts.